Hello, this is part 3 of my DVD collection video where I talk about my favorite horror films that came out in the 1990s, but if you haven't already, go check out the first 2 parts of this video. The first movie I want to talk about for this part of the video is The Prophecy, and I freaking love this movie. I honestly find it to be a pretty underrated film. Like, sure it has a pretty big following, but at the same time though, it's not really talked about the same way that a lot of other horror films are talked about, and I think it's a really good movie. And it is a horror film, but it's also kind of an action film, and it's also a dark fantasy film as well, and it's also sort of like a theological thriller. I really enjoy this movie, and this movie had a couple of sequels made to it, but none of the sequels were anywhere near as good as the first one, but I'm actually planning on reviewing all the Prophecy movies this October. The next movie I want to talk about is From Dusk Till Dawn, which was written by Quentin Tarantino and directed by Robert Rodriguez, and honestly, this might actually be my favorite Robert Rodriguez movie, and even though it's not actually a Tarantino movie, because he did write this movie and because he was such a big part of this film, I do kind of count it as a Tarantino movie, even though he didn't actually direct it. And honestly, if you look at this as a Tarantino film as well, I also consider this to be my favorite Tarantino movie. It's also one of my favorite vampire movies as well, and one of the things I really love about this movie is it doesn't start out as a horror film. It actually starts out as this, over-the-top crime drama film, but then by the second half of the movie it becomes this over-the-top horror comedy, and the tone of the movie does a complete 180, and normally that could kill a movie, but I personally love the movie because of that. I love that the movie just radically changes tones, midway through. I'm also planning on reviewing this movie and its 2 sequels this October. The next movie I want to talk about is a film I don't have on DVD, I have it on VHS, and that is The Craft, and I personally do enjoy The Craft. I think it's a really good movie. Yes, I know it's a horror film that's intended more for a female audience, but I don't think there's anything wrong with that, and I still think it's a really good film. The next movie I want to talk about is The Frighteners, which is arguably more of a fantasy comedy than a straightforward horror film, but it has some definite horror elements, and The Frighteners was co-written and directed by Peter Jackson, and I feel like this is one of Peter Jackson's more underrated films because it kind of came out during this, transitional period for Jackson, because he started out doing these really over-the-top and gory horror comedy films. Then he did a drama like Heavenly Creatures, which really shot him into the mainstream, and now he's mostly known for doing the Lord of the Rings movies. But this movie, I feel like, has been mostly forgotten by a lot of Peter Jackson fans, but I really do enjoy The Frighteners. It's definitely not as, gory as his earlier horror comedy films, like Bad Taste and Dead Alive, and it's not as, well-made as, say, the Lord of the Rings movies, but it's still, a really, really fun movie. The next movie I want to talk about is Pinocchio's Revenge, which is more of a guilty pleasure, and I'll admit this is not a terribly great movie, but it's a film I've always enjoyed, and for some reason this movie really does kind of get to me because there is sort of an element of psychological horror to this movie, which I really liked. I mean, the film is for the most part a Child's Play ripoff. I mean, to a certain extent. I mean, it's more of a Child's Play cash-in, I should say. It's not a full-fledged ripoff, and I will say, though, it's a much more psychological film than you might be expecting, and I think that's why I enjoy the film, despite its flaws. The next movie I want to talk about is Bad Moon, which is a really well-done werewolf movie, and it's actually written and directed by Eric Red, who also wrote movies like Near Dark and The Hitcher. And the movie's unique in the sense that the hero of the movie is actually a dog. I shit you not. The hero of the movie is actually the family's dog. It's a really good movie. I would definitely recommend it. And I have the movie on this DVD set right here where it comes with 3 other horror films. The next movie I want to talk about is Lost Highway, which I think is one of David Lynch's most underrated films. I really love this movie, and somewhere down the line I might do a standalone review of this movie because there's actually a lot that I want to say about this film, and I feel like it's one of David Lynch's films that's been mostly forgotten about, which I think is a shame because I think it's one of his best. The next movie I want to talk about is Jack Frost, which I'll admit is not a great movie, but it's a fun movie. It's a really, really fun film. It's kind of like the Leprechaun movies for me, where the movie's a pure guilty pleasure, but basically this is about a serial killer who gets exposed to this chemical which actually transforms him into a killer snowman, and the movie's just as ridiculous as it sounds. The next movie I want to talk about is The Relic, which I remember seeing when I was a little kid, and when I was a little kid I dug the hell out of this movie because I thought the monster was so cool looking, and I saw the movie again for the first time in maybe about 15 years, and the movie's actually held up surprisingly well for me, especially the creature effects in this movie. I mean, there is some fake looking CGI at the end of the film, but for the most part the monster effects in the movie has held up really freaking well. The only thing about this movie that didn't hold up very well for me is the lighting. Honestly, this is one of the most poorly lit movies I've ever seen, but besides that, it's actually not a bad movie. Like, if you could look past the really bad lighting, it's not a bad monster movie, though. Now, I know the movie's based on a book that was actually the first of a series of books. Now, I've never read the book, so I don't know how well this movie compares to the novel, but I actually do have one of the books in this series, but it's one of the sequel novels, and obviously I'm not going to read that until I read the other books in the series that led up to that one. The next movie I want to talk about is Event Horizon, which was directed by Paul W.S. Anderson, and honestly, this is probably Paul W.S. Anderson's best film. Compared to a lot of the movies he's done, this is easily his best movie. And the best way I can describe this movie is it's basically a hybrid between Hellraiser, The Shining, and Alien. Now, the movie's about this spaceship that disappeared 7 years prior to the events of this movie, but now it's somehow come back, and this rescue team is sent up to investigate what happened, and basically in the movie you find out that this ship had a machine on it that could actually open up dimensional gateways, which allowed it to travel through space faster, but it actually opened the gateway to hell, and the spaceship actually got sucked into hell, but now it's come back. But now that it's come back, it brought something back with it. But yeah, I love Event Horizon. I don't think it's a flawless film. Like, I do think there's some unnecessary comic relief in the movie, but I'm willing to look past that because there are some genuinely creepy moments in this movie, and overall I think the movie's very effective. The next movie I want to talk about is Mimic, which was directed by Guillermo del Toro, and this was del Toro's first American movie, and I've always enjoyed Mimic myself. I know del Toro was never really happy with this movie, but I've always enjoyed the film myself. Now, one of the reasons why del Toro was never happy with this movie was because the production company really did sort of interfere with this movie, which honestly isn't surprising given that this movie was put out by the Weinsteins, and yes, I know that name has a whole new meaning now, given what's come to light about Harvey Weinstein, but the Weinsteins were known for really sort of messing with the productions of certain movies that their names were attached to. And yes, they did put out a lot of great movies in the 1990s. They also screwed up a lot of what could have been great movies. Now, I haven't seen the director's cut of this movie, and yes, I know the director's cut is widely available now, but since I haven't seen the director's cut, I really can't say for sure how much Harvey Penis Hands screwed this movie up. I'm sure if I seen the director's cut, I might be like, okay, he did really fuck this movie up, but since this is the only cut I've seen of the movie so far, I still like this cut of the movie. The next movie I want to talk about is Wishmaster, which I actually think is a really fun movie, and I also recommend the sequel, Wishmaster 2, as well. I think they're both really good movies. Now, there were two other Wishmaster movies after this, but I don't think the other two were anywhere near as good as the first two movies. The next movie I want to talk about is The Devil's Advocate, which I really enjoy. Basically, it's about this lawyer who becomes a part of this law firm in New York City, but eventually he finds out that this law firm is actually run by Satan himself. One of the things I really do love about this movie is I love how it's simultaneously a courtroom drama and a supernatural horror film in one. And there are some really freaking creepy scenes in this movie. Like, in the movie, the main character's wife is having these horrific hallucinations, and I remember those scenes, particularly the scene with the baby, really freaked me the fuck out when I was a little kid. And also, it's just a very well-made and very well-acted movie, especially from Al Pacino, who plays the devil in this movie. He gives a phenomenal performance, and so does Charlize Theron as the main character's wife. She's actually probably the best performance in the entire film, and Keanu Reeves actually does do a pretty good job in this movie as well. Now, the movie's based on a book by Andrew Niederman, and I have read the book, and honestly, I think this movie improves upon the novel, because the book I thought was just okay. I think the filmmakers behind this movie took an okay book and made it a great movie. The next movie I want to talk about is Cube, which is about these people who wake up in this mysterious cube-like structure, and it's filled with all these booby traps and stuff like that. It's a really good movie, and it's sort of like a precursor to the Saw movies in some way. Like, you could definitely tell the Saw movies might have taken some inspiration from this film, especially the second Saw movie, and it also has sort of a Twilight Zone feel to it as well. The next movie I want to talk about is a film that you could argue is not really a horror film, but I personally think this movie has, at the very least, horror elements, and I've mentioned before that I don't think genre is a set-in-stone thing. I mean, yes, there are some movies out there that are obviously of a particular genre, but there are some movies where I think the genre is more of a matter of opinion, and a movie can be of more than one genre at the same time. But the movie I chose to talk about is Dark City. Now, once again, I understand a lot of people probably don't consider this to be a horror film, but I do think the movie has, at the very least, horror elements, but admittedly it is more of a science fiction film than a horror film. But the thing about this movie is I feel like this movie almost defies classification because it is a science fiction film, but as I said, I think it does have horror elements. It also is very much sort of a neo-noir kind of film and a detective thriller, and it's kind of a superhero film in a way as well. Like, the main character does become kind of a superhero by the end of this. But regardless of what genre you place Dark City into, Dark City is still a brilliant movie, and I've only seen the director's cut of this movie, but from everything I've heard of the theatrical version, it sounds like the theatrical version kind of gives everything away in, like, the opening scene, and this is really a movie that you kind of have to go into cold, because I remember when I first saw this movie, I had very little knowledge of what this movie was actually about, and this movie blew me the fuck away. But once again, it's a brilliant movie, and the only reason I'm putting it in this video is I do consider it to have horror elements, but you could argue whether this is really a horror film or not. But once again, it's a film that I think kind of defies classification. The next movie I want to talk about is another film where you really could debate whether it's horror or not, but it's based on a TV series that I do consider to be a horror series. Actually, the show, I think, combines a lot of different genres, but the movie I want to talk about is X-Files Fight the Future, which was the spin-off of the TV series The X-Files, and Admittedly, this is more of a science fiction film than a full-fledged horror film, but it has some definite horror elements, and the show it's based on, The X-Files, while being a science fiction series, was also just as much a horror series. But I actually really do like this movie, but I'm also a really big fan of the show The X-Files, and this is a movie that I can only recommend if you're a follower of the show, because the movie itself is essentially just an elongated theatrical episode of the show, and it's actually set between, I think, seasons 5 and 6. But I think it's a great movie for X-Files fans, and the aliens in this movie used to freak me the fuck out when I was a little kid. Like, I was actually, for some reason, I was afraid I was gonna see these guys in my basement. Like, alien abduction stuff has always kind of freaked me out, but for some reason the aliens in this movie really freaked me out. Now, I don't have the movie on DVD, I actually have it on VHS, and as you can see, I lost the case for this movie a long time ago. The next movie I want to talk about is Darren Aronofsky's first movie, Pi, which is another movie where you could very much debate whether it's horror or not. I do consider this to be a horror film. I mean, definitely a psychological horror film, but it's still horror, at least in my opinion. Like, there's some nightmarish images in this movie, but once again, I mean, it's a movie where the genre I don't think is set in stone. But I do think it's a very creepy and very thought-provoking movie. The next movie I want to talk about is the first Blade movie. Yet again, another movie where you could very much debate whether or not it's really horror. Admittedly, this is more of an action film, but I do consider it to be kind of a horror film as well. I mean, it's about vampires, and yes, I know, just because something's about vampires doesn't automatically make it horror, but yes, it's more of an action film, but it's an action movie that does at least have horror elements. So I think you could still make a case for this being a horror film. The next movie I want to talk about was actually a made-for-TV miniseries, and that is Storm of the Century, which was a miniseries written by Stephen King. Now, this wasn't based on a book by Stephen King. Stephen King only wrote the teleplay for this movie. But I love Storm of the Century, and one of the things I love about this movie is, even though it's not based on a book by Stephen King, it very much has the feel of a Stephen King novel. It feels like a Stephen King novel literally put on television. Because it's actually set in the same universe as a lot of Stephen King's books. Like, they mention Dolores Claiborne at one point in this movie, they mention the town of Derry from It in this movie, and also the main villain of the movie, I feel like has some kind of connection with the Dark Tower mythos, because he is very much an evil wizard, kind of like Randall Flagg in a way. So I highly recommend this movie if you're a Stephen King fan. Basically, it's about this small island community that is getting prepared for this major storm that is about to happen, and this mysterious stranger rolls into town who seems to know everybody's darkest secrets. The next movie I want to talk about is Audition, which is a really good freaking movie. Admittedly, it's been a while since I've seen this movie. It's a movie I've been meaning to rewatch, and I've actually been thinking of doing a standalone review on this movie at some point. But Audition is a very good and very creepy and very disturbing film. I highly recommend it. And the final movie I want to talk about is The Blair Witch Project, which I don't care what people say about this movie, I still think this movie is creepy as all fuck. Like, as overdone as found footage movies are now, this movie really does do the found footage gimmick right. And the film really does have a sense of realism, like it really feels like this was actual footage that somebody found out in the woods of 3 people getting lost in the woods and being pursued by somebody or something. And yes, I know it wasn't real, but this movie actually fooled a lot of people. There were a lot of people who legitimately thought this was real. Now, if you want to know more of my thoughts on this movie, just check out the review I did of this movie back in 2016. So yeah, that concludes my 3-part video of my favorite horror films from the 1990s. Let me know in the comments section down below what some of your favorite horror films from the 1990s were, and let me know what you thought of some of my picks.